Okay, thank you, Mr. Kaizuka. So this is day 2 of a BOJ-IMES conference of 2024, and we will be mainly talking about the conventional and especially unconventional policy instrument effects of both of those monetary policy instruments. And today's keynote speech, it will be given by Professor Markus Brunnermeier, as Kaizuka-san introduced. And he's a professor at Princeton University, and also at the same time international advisor to the BOJ's Institute of Monetary and Economic Studies. And his talk is titled in parentheses, Conventional Monetary Policy and Resilience. So I guess he will talk about both conventional and unconventional, and also this notion of resilience apply to monetary policy. Markus?
Thanks a lot. It's an honor to give this keynote. So I will talk about conventional and unconventional monetary policy, the interaction of both, in particular in the light of resilience. And monetary policy is, of course, a resilience instrument. Once you face a negative shock, you want to bring and bounce back, you want to bring the economy back. Now, of course, there are different approaches to monetary policy. One is the risk management approach, where you not only take the various probabilities into account, but also how bad will it be or how good will it be if certain events occur. So it's you go beyond a symmetric rule because you also weight essentially with the payoffs, the outcomes when you have a risk management approach. What's a resilience approach? A resilience approach is more or less what happens after you face a shock. You test the waters, you take some risks. Once you face a shock, you act such that you can bounce back. So the bouncing back is very important. So, for example, if the inflation goes up and gets de-anchored, you might not be able to bounce back. So the anchor of the inflation is a very important element to it. And when you go in the other direction, you might be able more easily to bounce back or not, depending on what your underlying theory is. Now, there's also a robustness approach. So robustness approach is it should work in all circumstances, in particular in the worst circumstances. So you prepare for the worst circumstances. And in this way, while in resilience, it's mostly the reaction, so the ability to adapt and react to that, which is the key. In a robustness approach, it's mostly that there's no reaction needed. It's very robust to it. Rigid rules will do it, and you don't have to react. Sometimes I compare this, the reed and the oak. The reed is constantly swinging back and forth and bounces back, where the oak is very rigid. Standing there, it's very robust in a sense, but when there's a really big shock, it might fall over and cannot bounce back. So you want to have this resilience element to that. And of course, if you go for a resilience element, you can actually take on more risk. So you might actually have some suffer and fallbacks occasionally, but if you bounce back, it's actually in the long run, it will be much better off than a robust or risk-free approach, which is the dashed line here, which has a lower expected growth rate. But in the long run, you might be even much worse off compared to the more risky but resilient approach. And the question is, how can we achieve this resilience going forward? And one striking feature, if you look at, for example, the log scale of GDP growth, or GDP levels in real terms in the United States from 1900 till today, you see that the economy, there's a lot of booms and recessions, but the economy is always bouncing back in the United States. So it's a marvelously element that actually, it goes almost, there's a little kink somewhere, but mostly it's actually going back. It's only when there are big financial crises that actually there's no bounce back. There's a lack of resilience. So you have this in the Great Depression, of course, with the Second World War, you bounce back, so we came back. But you see in 2007, 2008, we fell off this trend line, and actually, COVID, you can see we bounced back to the old trend line. So here I zoom in. So you can see that, there's a huge gap opening up. This gap is about 3 to 4 trillion a year, dollars. Okay, so we didn't bounce back after the global financial crisis, and we're still actually at a much lower trend line. COVID itself, which you might argue was a bigger shock, actually we bounced back. In the United States, we bounced back from the sense. If you look at Japan, you can also draw some certain trend lines. You see that, the banking crisis here, you see the earlier banking crisis, 97. You said there was, of course, a huge catch-up phase, and then it bounced back. So it's less striking. The resilience is less striking in the Japanese GDP data. The other thing is I would like to emphasize is that in order to make the macroeconomy resilient, it is essential that often the microeconomy is not resilient. That means that at the micro level, you don't want that every firm is bouncing back. You really want that certain firms can go bankrupt and free up resources for the macroeconomy to be resilient. That is, you don't want to hold, for example, zombie firms alive to make them resilient, because this actually hurts the macroeconomic resilience. So there's a fallacy of composition, using Keynes' words. There's the aggregation of resilience from the micro level to the macro level is not like, oh, I want to have everything resilient and the macro level is resilient as well. I would like that at the micro level, I would like to have non-resilience. There has to be some turnover, some evolution going on, some Schumpeterian creative destruction. Now, what are resilience killers or resilience barriers? So going back to my earlier figure, you can see that once you hit a certain barrier, let's say that's a trap, you might be trapped and don't bounce back. So what you really want to do is when you look at risks, you want to say, okay, there's a risk from which I can bounce back, so I shouldn't worry so much. If I can react to that and I can adapt to that, I can bounce back. And other risks, I will be trapped, I don't bounce back. So you really don't want to say what's risky, what's not risky. That's what the risk management approach asks you to do. You want to say, from which risk can I bounce back by reacting in a particular way, and from which risk can I not bounce back? And that should be this dividing line between what's risky and what's not risky, or what's resilient. So for example, if something is a trap, then actually you should watch out for, because you won't bounce back, and then you rather take the dashed line because you will be stuck here at this trap line. Similarly, if you have a tipping point, so when you hit a tipping point, then things get even worse. Things might spiral out of control, and then actually the situation is getting much, much worse. So there might be some adverse feedback loops kicking in, and then the situation might be much worse. So what you really want to watch out for, where are the tipping points, where are the traps, rather than is this risky or not risky. The question is always, even if it's risky, it might also give you opportunities, a high expected growth rate, and you might be able to bounce back. Now, what's the difference between this risk management approach and the resilience approach? You might say, okay, risk management is avoiding risk or diversifying risk. So you take on certain risk, which you can diversify away and other things. But resilience is more, how will I react after the shock hit? So what's my ability to adapt to the shock and then can bounce back? So one is the risk management approach. What do I do at time t? What's the correlation structure? How well can I diversify? The resilience approach is about t plus 1. The shock happens at t. What can I do at t plus 1? And of course, I will prepare at time t to be able to react at t plus 1. So I want to invest in adaptability, in agility, in ability to react. So I want to invest in something which has substitutability, is more easy. I can substitute from one to the other. I can scale up easily. Something happens, something goes wrong in one project, and it goes well in the other project. It's not what's the correlation between the two projects. Can I scale up the project which does well, and I can scale down the project which is not doing so well? It's all about the adjustment cost. How easily can I scale up the winners and the losers? Liquidity is naturally a resilience friend because it allows you to adjust your portfolio more easily, so in the finance context. And you also might want to do some at time t, so I can push certain tipping points and certain trap points further away. So I can push, for example, this was my tipping point. I can push it further away, so then actually when I push it down, I can still bounce back. And this essentially is a different philosophy. Essentially, how can I bounce back, and what can I do to make my economy more easily bounce back, and also from an macroeconomic monetary policy perspective. Now, where are these traps and tipping points in monetary settings where there's no bouncing back and there's no resilience? So you want to avoid these traps, and forward guidance is such a trap. Forward guidance is naturally, you bind your hands, you cannot react, you cannot adapt to that. There's also a fiscal dominance trap. Of course, if the fiscal authorities limit what the central bank can do, you will be trapped as well. And this is, of course, touching immediately in central bank independence. And there's also financial dominance trap. where the financial sector doesn't allow the central bank to do something because you might trigger then a financial crisis or financial difficulties. And macroprudential policy might be a way to limit the possibility of financial dominance going forward. So all of these things you can see as a trap. But it's not so simple saying, I don't want to do any commitment, it's all a trap. There's actually what I call this monetary policy resilience dilemma. So if you have no commitment power at all, monetary policy has no bite either. So you have to have a clear rule. You have to have some commitment to something in order for monetary policy to have some power to affect the long-term interest rate as well. But on the other hand, for resilience, you would like to have some adaptability. So you want to react to something. So on the one hand, you want to have some commitment power to something in order to have, for monetary policy, to have some bite. If it's only, you have no credibility and nobody knows what you will do down the road, monetary policy will have no bite. But on the other hand, you want the flexibility and the adaptability to react to new circumstances as they come forward. Now, what's this approach? So if you have a commitment to a fixed action, so let's suppose, so I commit not to raise the interest rates for the next 2 years or something, then you have essentially no adaptability. You cannot react to it. So there's no possibility to react to certain new contingencies. So if risk emerges, you cannot react to that. Now you can say, fine, I don't commit to a fixed action. I'm commit to a rule, and the rule has all the states of the world in it. So it's not a simple rule like a Taylor rule where there are 2 input variables, but you have all states of the world in this rule. Then you can, the rule says you commit to this rule, and the rule then specifies how you will react to that. And this gives you adaptability to new circumstances, but of course it only works if you can foresee all the various contingencies. And most of the world, we have unforeseen contingencies. Of course, you might argue, that Russia invades Ukraine was a foreseen contingency. We knew for a few weeks before that this might be a possibility, and we could have written a rule or some contingent plan to react to that in a sense. So we can commit to this particular contingent plan. Similarly, we could design now a rule if China were to block Taiwan. I don't know whether central banks have these contingency plans going forward. But essentially, there's this conflict, essentially, where you would like to have some more commitment. This gives you, the commitment gives you a credibility in the present, so it gives you more power in the present. If you can in the future say, I will not do this, so I have more, monetary policy has more power today, but for the future, for the adaptability, you would like to have more flexibility for the future. And that's the tension you constantly have in what is called its monetary policy resilience dilemma. And you have to find some interior optimum between the two forces. And of course, how you do that is to have a certain institutional design, central bank independency, central bank balance sheet, and so forth. And then you have the question, how much, where is this interior optimum? And that, of course, depends, how big is this time and consistency problem you're facing? So to sacrifice the adaptability and also sacrifice resilience. And if there's more risk, if there's less predictability, we live in a world where there's more risk going on, then you might want to go for more refined rules to adapt. Or if it's more, less forecastability, which means there's a lot more unforeseen contingencies, you go for more discretion. And that's the optimal thing. The balance between two forces is shifting to more discretion away from the rules. Now, as I mentioned, so one of the very striking elements is forward guidance. So this could be the explicit Odyssean forward guidance. That's a trap. It traps you in the future. You cannot adjust to that. We have experimented with that, and it's got to some extent discredited. But there is also, as Antonasio mentioned last year in the same conference, a lot of hidden forward guidance, where we said, we have a data-driven approach, which was essentially a language to say we will not do anything until the unemployment is X, which is also a forward guidance. Or we had the sequencing where we say, we only raise interest rates after QE is stopped. And that's why in the US, for example, till February 2022, still mortgage mortgage-backed securities were bought at a high level, pushing down the mortgage rates to 2% or whatever, even though the inflation was already higher. So that's essentially the sequencing promise, and these promises, they are bind your hands, and it takes some resilience away because you cannot adapt to the new circumstances as they unfold. Now, the next thing is what I would like to talk is about fiscal dominance over monetary dominance. And of course, we have heard yesterday already the fiscal theory of the price level, and that's one view. And then there's also another view where it's like more short-term aggregate demand perspective on the fiscal, that fiscal action affects things as well. But what I want to go after is, you know, when you look at the debt levels in various advanced countries, and these are the CBO projections for the United States, and they go to 200%, and this does not include making the tax cut by Trump permanent, so that there's actually, if you take what's expected, it would be much more dramatic. And so the interest rate expenses for the fiscal authorities will be much more dramatic, and the tensions between the fiscal authority and the monetary authorities will be much more dramatic going forward. So this independence will be under threat. There will be more political pressure coming to central banks, and that essentially makes monetary policy more challenging going forward. Now, what can you do in order to maintain fiscal dominance? I think one important thing is, of course, and flexibility and adaptability, and hence resilience, is to, you know, have good communication, not only to the marketplace, but also to the citizens, to build up a good reputation with the citizens, and to develop narratives which are very convincing to the citizens. So if your central bank has a good standing with the general public, and it will then, when the blame games come, will have, you know, a much easier standing to defend its independence. So for central bank communication will be much more important in a world where the tensions will be much more severe due to the high public debt level. Now, of course, what's also important is that the central bank are well capitalized. They don't have to ask the finance ministry to be recapitalized. That weakens their independence. And of course, central banks can run a negative central bank balance sheet, so with negative equity. But what we should do, we should not measure really the size of the central bank balance sheet with dollars or yen or euros, but in terms of risk. So there should be a risk measure. It depends on the shock. How will the central bank look like? And even though the central bank can run with negative equity, there's a headline risk. It hurts the communication towards the bubble if the newspapers say central bank equity is now negative. And that might be also a trap in this sense. Now, one important element is the interest rate paid on reserves. Right now, the interest rate is 4 or 5%, not in Japan, but in parts of Europe and in the United States, is a huge outflow from the central bank's balance sheet. And the cost of the running cost for the central bank goes up dramatically. And there's essentially a new tool to be considered, which, you know, how big are the required reserves and how big are the excess reserves? So with all the QE measures we did over the last decades, we increased the amount of reserves in the system tremendously. Most of them are excess reserves, and they're enumerated at the policy rate. That's a huge transfer of wealth to the private banking system. Okay? So you might argue what matters for policymaking is the marginal interest rate, not the average interest rate. So if you increase the required reserves, and you say, let's say, pay a lower interest rate or no interest rate on the required interest rates, the transfer is essentially much lower to the private banking system. So there's a tension if the Fed or the central bank more generally is raising the interest rate, immediately there will be huge payments to the private banking sector on all the excess reserves. And this will actually cut back the profits on the fiscal authorities. And that will create tensions between the fiscal authorities and the central bank. At some point, the politicians will say, why do we transfer billions of dollars to the private banking sector? And there will be redistribution, essentially saying, if I increase the amount of acquired reserves, there will be small amounts of payments to the private banks. And that's, you know, makes, of course, the banks less well capitalized. The financial resilience will go down. But on the other hand, it helps the fiscal, reduces fiscal dominance, and so the monetary dominance is more prominent in this sense. Of course, there's heterogeneity in the private banking sector, so doing this will hurt some banks much more than other banks. So if you have banks which have a lot of excess reserves, they will be hurt more by doing this. But essentially the key is that for policy purposes, the interest rate which matters is the marginal interest rate, the large dollar, and not the average interest rate. And you can have a lump sum tax essentially on the private banking sector by increasing the required reserves. Now, the next thing I would like to talk about is financial dominance more explicitly, and managing the price and financial stability trade-off with QE. So if you think about QE has different channels. So Ben Bernanke famously said, the problem with QE is that it works in practice, but it doesn't work in theory. I think now we have some theories where it works, finally. So there are certain QE, it changes the current constraints of banks, and it also changes asset prices. But QE can also have implications for the future. Again, with respect to resilience, how can I react going forward? So how does it relax current constraints? So if you take some assets from the bank's balance sheet and replace them with reserves through QE, you might relax their constraints. If you do QE with government bonds, this doesn't do much because government bonds don't have really a lot of constraints. There are zero risk weights, there are sovereign bonds, so you don't relax big constraints. But if you take off some other assets, risky assets with positive risk weights, you relax the bank's constraints, and this actually then can stimulate the economy to the extent the collateral constraint or the regulatory constraint is the driving constraint. Now there's a different channel where I say, okay, I can also buy some of these assets to reduce the term spread, buy long-term assets, reduce the term spread, or reduce the risk premium. That works in a world with market frictions. If you have segmented markets, for example, then actually it makes a big difference to change the term spread and change the risk premium if in such a world. If markets are perfect, this is actually not so dramatic, so it doesn't do so much. But what I really want to go after is how QE, or quantitative tightening going the other way, changes the interaction between interest rate policy and QE. So first of all, if you do a lot of QE, you buy long-term government bonds, of course, you take the duration risk on the central bank's balance sheet. If you raise interest rates, the central bank will make huge losses. Okay? The interest rate it will get on these government bonds will be low, even though inflation is high, so nominal interest rate is low, there will be losses on the central bank balance sheet. And if the central bank raises interest rates, immediately it will make bigger losses, and in a sense, it's a credible commitment device not to raise interest rates. It's like a costly signaling channel, where they say, oh, we have all these bonds on our balance sheet. If we were to raise interest rates, it creates all these losses. Because a balance sheet will be ruined, we have to ask for recapitalization from the finance ministry. We don't want to do that. So it's a signal to the market, we will not raise interest rates so quickly. Okay? That's a channel how it works, and this is essentially like an implicit forward guidance, to have a credible forward guidance. Now, the thing I want to focus on that really is based on some work I did with Andrei Alexandrov, how QE can actually make financial dominance less likely. How can QE reduce the conflict between price and financial stability? So if you think about interest rate policy, it has a dual role. It has, on the one hand, it is an inflation stabilizer, the standard New Keynesian channel, but it also redistributes wealth through the long-term bonds. Presume stepping on the rake, but if you have a sector with a financial system, where the financial system has a lot of this long-term bond, there's redistribution going on to or away from the financial sector. And you can see if you raise interest rates, it brought some institutions like Silicon Valley Bank, First Republic into difficulties. Now what you can say, I use QE as a preparatory element to make it feasible to raise interest rates more sharply down the road. If I buy long-term bonds, take it out of the bank's balance sheets or out of the private hands balance sheet, then it frees up my ability to raise interest rates more dramatically subsequently, okay, if the shock were to arrive. Normally, if I don't do that, it might be the case, oh, there's a shock, I have to raise interest rates, inflation is popping up, but I don't really want to raise interest rates because actually it will make the financial system into difficulties. In particular, part of the financial system which is loaded on these long-term assets. So it limits how much interest rate policy I can do for the inflation stability reasons and output gap considerations. But if I take these long-term bonds out, it frees up the way for me to do more freely adapt and adjust and have more resilience from the interest rate policy. There is an interaction between unconventional and conventional monetary policy. The unconventional policy done ex ante in the right way gives me more room to do the conventional policy in a more effective way. So the optimal policy is a preparatory QE to reduce the trade-off between price and financial stability, and then I can have a more aggressive interest rate policy down the road, and that improves essentially resilience. Now, the other things I wanted to say about resilience, I've talked a lot about resilience. We have to do something ex ante if a shock occurs. Okay? But we don't have only shocks, we also have shifts. So we talk a lot about shocks, or there's invasion of Ukraine, there might be, there's COVID shock and so forth, there might be other shocks coming up. But you also have shifts, transition phases. And how do we manage these transition phases? What's the role of monetary policy in these transition phases? And for these, you need some resilience as well. What are these transition phases? So the green transition, this of course will impact our star. So we have a huge amount of investment needed. There's a huge investment demand coming up. And if we do it very fast, we have to throw away a capital stock, a brown capital stock, replace with a green capital stock. That leads to a huge investment demand, pushes up our star. There's big shifts on working from home. We talked about this later. Demographic changes, deglobalization, digital money, all of these are big shifts. And the key is at what speed these transitions will occur in terms of resilience. If the shifts and the transitions happen at a slow pace, you can adjust to it. The adaptability will make sure that you actually bounce back. If it occurs very fast, actually you might hit a tipping point and you might drift away from these elements. So essentially what I would argue is that the transition phase, the speed of the shock, the speed of the change is the key driver which makes a system resilient or the economy resilient or not. If there's a slow transition, a sequence of small shocks, let's say, then you can react after each of it, and then actually can react to it, and then you will actually, even in the long run, it might be better. We will be in a better situation after the green transition. You make this transition, and it's fine. If it happens very fast and abrupt, you might not be able to reach this new bliss point, but you might drift up because you hit a tipping point before that. Now, let me just conclude with a final thought about exchange rate movements and resilience coming from exchange rate movements from this. So we talked about the different concepts: risk, robustness, resilience, and now the exchange rate moves. So the way I think about the international system, how you can get resilience through a flexible exchange rate system or versus buffer. So one way to think about the exchange rate adjustments is essentially a resilience instrument. It's an implicit transfer at the expense of other countries when you devalue your currency. And it could be that you think about there's a gentleman's agreement among the countries. Whichever country suffers a negative shock can devalue its currency to some extent, get some way to get some extra demand boost from the currency devaluation, and then come back from that. And the international community said, okay, that's how we help each other to bounce back, whoever faces some international shock. Of course, you can exploit this gentleman's agreement. That's like the beggar the neighbor economy or beggar the neighbor phenomenon, that even though you haven't really faced a shock, you do this currency devaluation, or you don't continuously do currency devaluation, even though there was no shock. And then this whole system doesn't really work anymore. But in general, a flexible exchange rate regime is a way to have some resilience after shock. You can more easily come back because the international community, let's say, temporarily allows you to devalue, and it's a mutual agreement, and this way you can bounce back, and that helps resilience. Of course, you can also build up resilience in a fixed exchange rate environment, but you have to have huge reserves where you say, okay, I have these huge reserves. If something goes wrong, I can spend the reserves. There are different ways to achieve resilience for a country in international context. Now, what matters in the resilience international, so safe assets is really an important element. So safe asset is a resilience instrument because safe asset, I can sell, I can adjust my portfolio position by if something goes wrong. Okay, I can sell it, and the safe asset is an asset which I can sell at a high price, at a low bid-ask spread, and is not information sensitive. So if there's suddenly the world becomes more risky, there's more idiosyncratic risk in the economy, everything is more risky, I can easily sell it. And actually this safe asset might even appreciate in bad times. It has a negative kappa M beta. So that's essentially what I call a safe asset. It's like a good friend. If we go in a crisis phase and risk is going up everywhere, it's actually not only can I sell it easily and has a high value, it actually appreciates in value. And the way you would price such an asset, and I don't have time to explain that, the price of this asset, the present value of the cash flows in terms of the government bond would be primary surpluses, but also some service flows, which comes from the fact it gives you the safety element to that. And let me illustrate the safety element very briefly here. So first, you can see here's the formula. Here's a phrase for a government bond. That's the nominal price of the government bonds divided by the price level. The cash flow of the government bond is the primary surpluses. Let's suppose it's zero. Government never gives any cash flow. The primary surplus is always zero, even negative. Let's keep it zero. So the two people, Alan and Bill, they have the safe asset with zero cash flows. They also have some positive cash flow asset. If the world goes up, Alan's cash flow expands and Bill's cash flow contracts, and the world goes down, it goes exactly in the opposite direction. And so in this world, Alan and Bill should write contracts to each other. Okay? They're perfectly negatively correlated risk to each other. They ideally should insure themselves. But let's suppose they can't do that because of market frictions. So the incomplete market frictions, they cannot do that. Can they do something which is, partially making up for these financial frictions? And they can do that. They can say if the world moves up, Alan is buying from Bill some of the zero cash flow asset in exchange for the positive cash flow asset. So essentially, even though Bill makes some losses, he gives some zero cash flow asset to Alan, but gets a positive cash flow asset from Alan. And if the world goes down, they trade in the opposite direction. So even though they cannot write contracts to each other, by holding the safe asset, the zero cash flow asset, and by trading, depending who made losses and who made gains, either in the world up, they trade in one direction, and the world moves down, they trade in the other direction, they can insure themselves by retrading, so they don't have to write some contracts directly. And you can see we valued, Alan and Bill value this feature coming from this retrading, so they will attach some positive value to this asset, even though it's zero cash flows. Okay, there's no cash flows in this asset. Standard asset pricing would say there's zero price to it, but it helps us to overcome these frictions, and the overcoming the friction, that's a service this asset provides, and we price the service flow. Okay? So that's the important insight. So you get some value. If this asset has some value, you can use it for retrading, and then we can improve our risk sharing, and we value this better risk sharing through retrading, and that assigns a positive value to this asset. Now, importantly, let's suppose we move into a world where the risk becomes more dramatic. If the risk becomes more dramatic, then actually this retrading becomes more valuable. So that means the present value of the service flow is actually going up even further. Okay? So even though it has zero cash flows, in bad times when the risk is high, the value goes up. So it has a negative kappa M beta. And ex ante, we value this. And if you have the privilege to issue an asset which pays essentially zero cash flows, but it provides some service flows, that's a privilege you have, an exorbitant privilege, where you can actually benefit from this setting. Now, as I said, this is resilience, risk on, risk off. When the risk goes up, then actually this value goes up, so it gives you more things. Of course, this exorbitant privilege might also go away. There might be default risk on this asset, and you might also lose the ability to issue this asset. That's for a country that actually also is something to consider. So let me conclude in terms of resilience and monetary policy, conventional and unconventional monetary policy. I would say resilience approach is very natural in monetary policy. That's what we do anyway. Once you hit a shock, we react to that, and we want to bring the economy to bounce back. We orchestrate a bounce back after the shock. But before the shock, at time t, we want to bring everything in place already. We want to remove traps and tipping points, and we want to increase the ability to bounce back before the shock at time t. There's this monetary policy resilience dilemma. On the one hand, you want to commit in order to have more power. I want to commit the future, but I also want to keep the flexibility in the future. It's like related to commitment versus discretion elements. Fiscal dominance and central bank independence. There's this additional tool we should actually explore. You can change the reserve requirements, and that's essentially just imposing a lump sum tax on the banking sector. Do we really want that? And that depends also how much you want to do this, how much is the pass-through to deposit holders. If you change the policy rate by 500 basis points, but there's no pass-through to the final citizens, why should suddenly the interest rate margins for the banks go up so dramatically? Okay? Or do you want to tax this away by increasing reserve requirements? How easy you can do that depends how heterogeneity the bank system is and so forth. But as a trade-off, you will hurt the banks, so financial resilience will go down, but you avoid fiscal dominance and you preserve your central bank independence more easily. Importantly, financial dominance, there's a trade-off between price and financial stability. Often you cannot do things because if I do that, it might actually hurt the financial stability. In advance, I can do some QE, QT balance sheet measures to bring my system into place, which frees up my ability to react subsequently when a shock were to occur. But I have to do this in anticipation, in preparation of potential future shocks. Then we have to of course, think about resilience to shifts, some transition phases instead of shocks. And then I mentioned in the last sentence how the exchange rate, the flexible exchange rate system, if set up correctly, is essentially a resilience measure as well. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you, Professor Brunnermeier. And we have a little bit over 10 minutes for discussions, and I'd like to follow the rule that we established yesterday to put your nameplate on the upright position if you have comments. Dr. Schnabel.
So thank you very much, Markus, for a really interesting presentation. I mean, there are many things that could be discussed, and we can still continue to discuss them during the panel, I assume. So just 2 points now. So first, the question is, what does your resilience approach imply for kind of current day-to-day policy making? So I would have thought that when it comes kind of to the anchoring of inflation expectations, that it would be a kind of risky approach to test the waters and then, you know, hope you can bounce back. But for me, kind of the de-anchoring would be kind of a trap. Therefore, I would argue that maybe a risk management or a robustness approach would be more appropriate here. But maybe you have a different view, and I would be interested. Second, on the minimum reserve requirements, that's of course not an easy topic. So let me ask you a few questions about that. So first, what would be the monetary policy argument for doing this? Because at least in our case, if we wanted to do this, we would need to have a monetary policy argument. So are we not talking about something that in the end should be done by governments? So introducing a bank tax if they believe that the transfer is too big. Second, so if we did this, could this weaken the future effectiveness of QE? So if there was expectations that if a bank sells a bond to us, that later they will be trapped at 0%, would that weaken the future effectiveness of QE? And third, wouldn't this introduce undesirable distributional effects, in the sense that, I mean, what we are worried about is that there are these banks with a high excess liquidity, which are getting all these, interest payments. But those are not necessarily the same banks that have high minimum reserve requirements, because those are the banks that have a high volume of deposits. These are just, these are really a very open question. I mean, I'm open on the topic, but I would like to hear your views. Thank you.
Let's take 3 more questions before I let you respond. Deputy Governor Uchida.
Thank you, and thank you for a very inspiring lecture. In particular, I found the part you explained how exchange rate regime works to stabilize this mechanism. And I agree that basically the flexible exchange rate regime will stabilize the economy and individual economies. But I think it could have an implications on the relativity of central bank's policy. I mean, for example, I think that the most important epoch for unconventional policy was 2010, when Chairman Bernanke started QE2 and intervening long-term interest rate. I wonder if other central banks have had any other choices than to follow that kind of things. So my question is that the policy approach you have just mentioned should be discussed not only in a domestic context, but in central bank community as a whole, because that's the even if the individual central bank change their regimes, it could have an implication, and it bounce back, actually, kind of bounce back from the attitude of other central banks. So, yeah, that's my question, and happy to have your observations. Thank you.
Dr. Jordan.
Thank you, and thank you, Markus, really for this great presentation. I have the following question. If I understood you correctly, your argument is that before increasing interest rates, we should take all the long-term bonds out of the banking system so that they do not cover the duration risk. And on the other hand, you are arguing that we should have very large reserve requirements so that only the marginal rate then actually is binding. So then the banking system again will then bear all the costs of the liquidity because they do not get any interest rate. Isn't that a contradiction in that respect?
Governor Ueda.
Yes. Just to make sure that I understand your analysis well. We at the BOJ have been buying, during the QE period, building up loss reserves by not transferring 100% of our incomes to the government. Now, in your framework, is it correct to regard this as an act of buying adaptability to prepare ourselves for the eventual QT period? Also, we've been buying not just government bonds, but equities as well. There's some portfolio diversification element in this. But as I heard your presentation, this is more like preparation for risk rather than buying adaptability. Is that a correct interpretation?
Let's pause here and ask Professor Brunnermeier to respond in a couple of minutes.
Thanks a lot. Very interesting questions.
Okay, sorry, it was not on. About the inflation anchor, I had a slide saying the inflation anchor is paramount for resilience. So you can't have any resilience without an inflation anchor. So it's very important to maintain the inflation anchor for a resilience perspective. So that's there. About the minimum reserve requirements on monetary policy, should the governments do it rather than central bank? it's essentially, there are two ways to, one is, de facto you can set two interest rates. You can set an interest rate for the policy rate, for the marginal unit, and you can set an interest rate for the required reserves. Could be 0 or could be 0.5%, whatever you want to move it to. So it is a monetary policy tool. There's always a border between what's fiscal, what's monetary. I would say in order to steer the macroeconomy, it's a tool to steer the macroeconomy. It's a tool to ensure financial stability. Essentially, you take out something from the financial sector. In this sense, I would say it's still part of the monetary policy element going on. And but that's, it probably has to be legally tested to what extent. This is a legal thing, but it weakens the central bank balance sheet and it undermines. So if you pay a high interest, it weakens the central bank balance sheet and it undermines then the independence of the central bank. And that's something which has to be guarded at the end of the day, also for the inflation anchor. And it has distributional effects. There's no question about that. But knowing that this is a tool and will be redistribution among the banks, so it is redistribution from the banks to non-banks or to the government, and the redistribution among the banks because reserves are held heterogeneously. And ideally, I would like to tax the banks who have a huge franchise value on their deposit side, if they pay a very low, with the pass-through and the deposit rate is very low. So what we have at the moment, we raise the interest rate, immediately it's very asymmetric. People who have debt, they get the high interest rate. People who have savings, they don't get the high interest rate. So it doesn't work for the savers, the pass-through, it works for the borrowers. I'm not sure that's an ideal framework. Deputy Governor Unida, about the exchange rate. So I think what this argument, it argues for that, we have essentially an international system where we help each other out through a flexible exchange rate. And by helping the country which faced a negative shock, it can devalue and can bounce back. And that's a gentleman's agreement. It's a national order we have. And we should use this as a very good thing, and it should not be abused by a beggar-than-neighbor policy. So that should be a common understanding. We should promote this and do that. Whether then you use that in terms, so it has two implications. One is we should coordinate monetary policy because to some extent in Basel or wherever we do that, coordinates, okay, we do that, we recognize a certain country has a certain particular shock. It should be, can be more loose monetary policy to get out of these difficulties. And there has to be some common understanding that we do that. The second element is, do we do then this by purchasing long-term bonds or cutting the policy interest rate? The argument is independent a little bit, so I have to talk carefully about whether buying long-term bonds or changing the policy rate, which way to do this best. That's then in a second step. I haven't carefully thought about the second element, I have to admit. So Thomas Jordan, you put it very drastic. I'm not saying you take all the long-term bonds out. You just look at the system and said, what's the interest rate exposure of the banking system? What's the duration risk? And does this hinder my freedom to do interest rate policy if a big shock comes? And you have to have an idea how big will the shock be and what interest rate policy do I need for managing the output gap given the price stickiness, the new Keynesian channel. I need a particular interest rate policy. And saying, I can probably not do it fully because it creates some financial instability issues. And if this is the case, then I do QE in preparation for that, take out some of these long-term bonds such that it frees up the space to do my regular interest rate policy. So I'm not arguing at all we should take out bigger, but it's just in the long run. So we always viewed QE as a crisis policy. It's a different perspective now. Saying, okay, it's a preparation for future crises. If a certain shock will occur, how big will it be? What measures do I have to take on the interest rate side? And it might be you cannot do it because the financial system is not able to handle this interest rate policy. So I take some of the duration risk out of the private banking system in order to have the freedom to react and adapt when the shock occurs. And in terms of the interaction reserve requirements, it is the banks, there's no way out. If you buy long-term bonds and citizens sell it in exchange of reserves, the banks have to take the reserves. There's no way. They cannot say, I cannot do it. You, as a central bank, you can always push the reserves on the banking system. It depends which bank will take it, so you can push it from one bank to another bank, but the whole banking system as a whole has to take these reserves. So they can't get out of this. Of course, the banking, that you might think is a tax on the banking system, which is a burden, but of course they get a lot of benefits too. They get lender of last resort, so that's a balancing act one has to keep in mind also in this setting. So Governor Ueda, about the hidden reserves the BOJ has built up, I think it's a very wise move, and many central banks have done this in anticipation of having some losses, that essentially have built up some hidden reserves. If losses can come, it can smooth essentially the losses because you've declared lower profits compared to what the actual profits were earlier on. And that's actually some smoothing going on through central bank policy. And that's, I think, a good thing. It also stabilizes not only the independence of the central bank, but also the smoothing helps also the fiscal authorities, that is, the central bank is doing that for the fiscal authorities. So overall, I think it makes it easier to adapt now when the central bank balance sheet is more constrained, preserves independence, and makes it easier to adapt. In this sense, it's a good thing to do. About the purchases of stocks and ETFs, I would say, so I said earlier, if you buy, let's say, government bonds, if the markets are not segmented, not much is happening. And it also doesn't free up any private banks' balance sheet constraints because government bonds anyway have zero risk weights. But if you buy something more risky, then you free up some balance sheet constraints because you take something out of the private sector which has some risk-bearing capacity is taken away from the private sector, is moved to the central bank. And this way it helps. In this sense, it's also stabilizing in this sense, and it's a good resilience instrument, that too.
Thank you. They have allowed me to extend this session just a little bit. So let's take 3 more quick questions and ask you to answer that. Professor Greenshaw?
Yes, thank you. So very interesting talk. I just had a question, like others, on using QE as a preparatory tool before raising interest rates. Couldn't we see this as the opposite of what you're arguing, which is that it's making financial dominance worse? I mean, if we're doing QE as a preparatory tool for raising interest rate, it's basically saying we're going to buy the long-term bonds from the market at the highest price. So we're basically removing all the risk from the bank's holdings of these long-term securities. This is like having a put option when you're holding the long-term bonds. The central bank could be coming in, and if rates are about to rise, they're going to buy it from you at a high price before they do this. And in a sense, isn't interest rate risk management, isn't that banking 101, that somehow you want to address it with macroprudential or microprudential tools rather? So it wasn't quite clear to me that this would alleviate financial dominance, maybe from an ex post point of view, but from ex ante, I thought this was going the other way. So, one way of converting this into our local context is you could have imagined the Bank of Japan saying before ending YCC, the long-term rates are going to rise on the 10-year BOJs bonds, so government bonds. So why doesn't the BOJ buy all the long-term bonds out there before ending YCC? And of course, that would have been locking in all the losses on the BOJ's balance sheet. And I think the path that was taken instead was much wiser than that. Anyway, I'm curious about your thoughts on this.
Dr. Evans?
Thank you. This is sort of my reaction to all of Markus's papers it's so complete. There are many things going on, and I just sort of get caught up in some of the small matters. I think the reaction I have is to the risk approach versus the resilience approach is, why are monetary policy mistakes permanent? Don't we tend to think that monetary effects should be, eventually transitory? They might be very persistent, but why permanent? When you sort of have the chart on the resilient path and robust and risk-free, I mean, it looks like there are permanent effects from certain monetary policy actions, which presumably means there's some interplay of fiscal real effects with what monetary policy is doing because of the different tools that are being used. And so I think a little more clarification along those lines would be helpful. We've certainly gone through a period where monetary policy has had persistent effects on the economy, not as positive as we would like, and sort of disentangling that would be certainly helpful for me in trying to figure out why certain types of forward guidance are as not as good, negative as you seem to be pursuing.
Professor Cochran.
Markus, this was great. I got to thank you because I usually go home with the prize for the wildest, craziest idea at a conference, and you just took it. But it's out of the box thinking that you always do, which I so appreciate. I learned so much. I want a general comment and a particular one. The general is, do we have the institutional capacity for this vision? We want our monetary policy to run on scientifically valid, robust understanding of the system, what we do. You want to think about nonlinearities, interaction effects, state dependence, tipping points where stable turns to unstable, and so forth. Do we have any idea? Those are there, I'm sure, but do we really know anything about where they are? For example, everybody thought there was a tipping point at the zero bound where the deflation spiral breaks out, and we've just learned that just isn't there. Nobody ever had a deflation spiral. Oh, well, that tipping point isn't there. Do we know where the other ones really are? You then go on, well, how about green, work from home, deglobalization, and so forth? Can we avoid those tipping points? And I go, really? Do we have any idea where those tipping points are? Our star went down. Real rates went down for 30 years. None of us really has any idea why, and certainly nobody ahead of time figured out why. Is our star going to go back up? Are we back to the zero bound? None of us knows why. So while they're great ideas, do we have the institutional capacity to see that sort of stuff ahead of time or to have any idea how it works? Remember, these are institutions that didn't see supply shocks and their effects on inflation. They didn't see that higher interest rates would lead banks to lose money, like Silicon Valley Bank. I'm not blaming anyone. We're just human. Our institutions can do what they can do. You have this vision, but I don't think our institutions and the humans in this room know enough about the system to start actually doing any of that. Okay, that's the big picture. The small picture. Your proposal to stop paying interest on reserves, you called it a transfer of wealth. I call it paying the market price. If you don't pay interest on reserves and you still got $5 trillion in reserves, that means banks are not going to be able to pay interest on deposits, and everybody runs to money market funds. Let's not forget, all the central bank is an enormous money market fund that holds government debt and has interest-paying stuff. So, I would just see money completely flowing out of banks and will complete the end of the banking system as opposed to a successful tax on that. What you're advocating really is a time-old policy, financial repression, to force us to hold low interest rates on government debt. But of course, that's a leaky sieve, as we have known for the centuries we've been trying that. Your second proposal, QE, to get all the risk out of the system before you start raising interest rates. I'll say louder what Pierre-Olivier said. Isn't that what regulators are for? I mean, regulators are supposed to say, hey, you got a lot of interest rate risk there. And in particular, we do not want to remove all duration risk from the system. Remember, if the First Bank of Bowman wants to hold duration risk, she can hold mortgages, she can hold corporate debts, she can hold international debts. If you want to stop any bank that could fail from having duration risk, you got to buy up all the long-term debt in the world. You're saying only the government can hold interest rate risk, but we want a system where interest rate risk is held by people who can hold it. The problem is that banks that issue run-prone deposits shouldn't be holding interest rate risk. But we want pension funds, mutual funds, high wealth investors, those people should be holding it. We want to get it in the right places, and just hoovering it up doesn't seem like it ought to do it. So there's regulations also. Equity, maybe if banks should be funded by equity. That solves the problem too. There's resilient systems here that solve it, as opposed to just hoovering up all duration risk from the markets first. Thank you.
Okay, Professor Brunnermeier.
Okay.
You have the last word.
Thanks a lot. So, just to repeat this, I'm not arguing we should take on all the duration risk on the central bank balance sheet. Not at all. But we should be aware of, it might limit our interest rate policy down the road. And so that's why we have to do it. So, in general, I'm also not arguing that it won't work this way, that the central bank should buy the long-term bonds at the height of when the price is very high and then interchange interest rates. Of course, it has to be taken into account at what price you buy it. You don't buy at the high price. If you communicate first that the interest rate will go up, the price will drop, and then react based on that. So not at all I'm arguing for, the central bank takes all the losses. That's not what I'm going for. The other thing is also I don't want to push all the losses onto the private banks now with this low interest on the required reserves. Now, in terms of Chris's question, whether permanent effects on monetary policy, I think if you have a very simple New Keynesian perspective, it's all about monetary policy is only temporary phenomenon because when stickiness goes away, with the stickiness going away, all the permanent effects go away. And in the long run, it will not have any impact. But if you have richer models where there's a portfolio choice and your monetary policy is affecting the real return on the government bonds, it affects the portfolio choice and then affects the investment rate and affects the growth rate of the economy. So there will be real effects, real implications from that. So monetary policy, in my view, has long-term effects. If you do it right, you get a much better long-term outcome, not only short-term outcome, because you bounce back and then the risk-taking of individual agents will change based on that. And it might have better outcome in the long run as well. So it's not only driven by temporary stickiness phenomenons. Now, but John's point about institutional capacity, nonlinearities, tipping points, and all that, I refuse to give up to say, oh, let's not think even about it. The world is complicated. Let's just pretend it's simple, and let's just do it this way because we don't have the institutional capacity. So I have an ideal that we can think about these things, and we might find a simple world. Einstein came up with this worldview we have. It's very complicated, but it helps us in many, many dimensions to shoot rockets in the space and so forth. And sometimes if you just look at the world from a different angle, you might find a simple way to represent it. But we have to start with a more complicated world and say, no, we don't understand this, and this is complicated, this is complicated. And then at some point, some clever guy will come up with a way to say, let's look from this strange angle, and everything is very simple, and we find a simple rule, like a Taylor rule, or some other rule which helps us to manage that. But we have to start the complicated way first as a first step. And is this financial repression not to pay interest on the reserves, on the required reserves? To some extent it is. But as I said, if the banking sector has a huge market power and doesn't pass it on to the savers, to the citizens at the end of the day, it's just a corrective force in this sense. So that's, we can call it financial repression and all this. I see the dangers of financial repression. I'm very worried about financial depression, actually, and we will end up in a financial depression world. I'm pretty convinced down the road if the government debt is not stopping to grow at this rate. That will be the outcome for sure in the next decade. And I try to some extent, having some currency competition, other elements, new fintech and all this might help us. But this helps only the well-educated, financially literate people who can avoid that. The big chunk of the citizens will suffer from that, and they will be taxed because they're less well financially educated. And there will be redistribution from the financially well-educated or from the financially less well-educated to the financially well-educated. And that's a big redistribution, and that might hurt our democracies down the road much more. Okay, that's probably too big a picture.
Thank you, Professor Brunnermeier, and thank you all for the lively discussion. I went 15 minutes over, but this concludes Keynote speech.